Kohan Immortal Sovereigns is a game that feels like it has been all but forgotten over the years. Though highly acclaimed at the time, it has faded away while we remember other bigger franchises like StarCraft and Age of Empires. And perhaps that is due to its very unique combination of 4X and RTS elements, which never really caught on in the real-time strategy space. The way Kohan handles unit construction is very different from what we consider to be the established norm these days, as you have to build companies out of different unit types: a frontline, 2 support units, and a commander. This allows you to create unique constructions of companies that behave in unique ways instead of having to create the equivalent of those companies on the fly while also maneuvering your units. While the latter approach is definitely more flexible in the moment, it introduces more micromanagement you have to handle, and I found the Kohan approach kind of refreshing, if I'm being honest. Though that's not to say it doesn't have its own problems. Namely, you can't mix things up on the battlefield based on your situation, and you also just don't have a lot to do in battles, as there's no micro adjustments to be made. Hell, the game even prevents you from doing what you think you'd be able to once a company is in combat. It just kinda locks them there, unable to disengage without hitting the retreat button. And there aren't any special abilities with which you can turn the tide if things start going the enemy's way. Something else you usually don't see in RTS games is Kohan's concept of supply. It's somewhat similar to how supply lines work in some 4X games. Essentially, within a certain distance of settlements you've established, companies can replenish their units automatically. I found this incredibly handy, as just like the companies themselves, this allowed for me to be less involved in micromanagement. As long as I could make it back to a supply zone with a partial company, they'd replenish themselves, instead of needing me to go and create new units manually almost constantly. I would very rarely lose entire companies throughout the game, and I'd almost always be able to limp back to town with just a single unit still alive, and then bring that company back to full strength. Yet another thing that feels much more like a 4X is that you just have a town or city you build structures within that, for the most part, you can only see in menus instead of having to lay out a traditional base. These structures govern which units you can build, as well as how much gold and resources that any given city generates over time, with more slots for structures opening up as you upgrade the city. Ultimately, at its core, the economy is pretty much centered around gold. You do have resources like stone, iron, and mana that you can generate by building structures within cities, but if you build a company that has an upkeep cost that's higher than the amount of any resource you currently have available, you simply go into a negative balance for that resource, which costs you gold. And most importantly, you do not have any reserves of the non-gold resources. So, if you then go construct a building that can produce more of that resource, the amount of gold you're bringing in increases. Now, unlike the other resources, gold does have a reserve, albeit with a cap, so you can drain your gold reserves for a little bit until you run out. Functionally, what this means for moment-to-moment gameplay is the most important thing is to keep your gold in the black by any means necessary. There are a lot of campaign missions where you'll start off bleeding gold pretty badly, and unless it's a mission that's pretty clearly designed for you to just roam around and engage in combat without doing any city building, which is admittedly a pretty common mission type, you want to get yourself to positive gold flow as soon as possible so that you can start safely building more companies. Because once you run out of gold, all your companies start slowly dying, no matter where they are on the field. All these elements come together to make Kohan a unique and interesting RTS still to this day. The few RTSs we do manage to get these days are all still in the traditional micro-heavy mold, and Kohan is something completely different, which means it still feels unique despite being as old as it is. The downside to a lot of these mechanics is the game also runs a lot slower than your usual RTS. Some people will hate this, I'm sure, but I enjoyed it for what it was, and I appreciated the ability in single player play to speed things up whenever I was just waiting around for things to happen. Something that would, of course, not be present in a multiplayer mode and could be a bit more painful there. Now, while the game is incredibly interesting and a lot of fun mechanically, it does fall down pretty hard when it comes to building a world and a story, something that RTS games had been getting better and better at over time when Kohan came out, but that it almost entirely fails at. There's some minor world building going on, and there's an attempt at telling a story about defeating a great evil with scattered voice dialogue and a handful of pre-rendered cutscenes that aren't voiced at all, but it all comes across like something that was just slapped on top of a much stronger mechanical foundation, and almost feels like it would have been better if they hadn't tried at all. Even barring the plot and the storytelling, Kohan's main single-player campaign is incredibly tedious, mostly consisting of very similar objectives over and over, with very little unit variety to be had for long stretches of time. I would have been fine with the length of the campaign if there was more to it, but as it is, it feels like an absolute slog by the time you get about halfway through. Ultimately, Kohan is a game that has some really fantastic ideas, and it's a fascinating peek into a different sort of RTS that could have sprung from it. But ultimately, it is let down by a less than stellar campaign, something that hurts it far more in this day and age when you're gonna really struggle with finding a match in multiplayer. The first handful of missions I played, I was having a really great time, but I quickly settled in and started finding things getting pretty boring. Still, I think this is one worth looking at for RTS fans, for a peek at what could have been, and it's easily purchasable on Steam, and it can be run on modern machines with very little effort using the CNC DDraw tool available over on GitHub.